Let's take a look at some power draw results that I've experienced since I've got these new units installed. So I've noticed some interesting results in power idle consumption with these new units since I've gotten them installed. I don't know if these results are due to the new firmware, if these results are due to additional changes made in the new units. I don't know, but let me just show you what we've got going on here. Both units are running in battery mode right now. Currently the grid input is turned on, but I have no loads set up on either inverter, and we'll verify that. I also have PV turned off as well. So here's our output, 0 watts output here on server 2. I got work on the brain. Inverter 1 here, 0 watts output, and I've got my solar assistant up and running next to my Victron, and you can see we've currently got 100 watt draw coming off the batteries. Idle consumption should be around 70 watts. Now I came across a thread in the DIY solar forums, and a comment was made by somebody from Signature Solar stating that anytime you have AC input hooked up and turned on, your idle consumption load is supposed to be taken from the grid, not from your batteries. So I thought, okay, well, let's test that out. We've got our 100 watt draw coming from these inverters, and if we put a meter on our AC input, 0.62 on one leg, 0.66 on the other leg, 6.4. So we've got about 50, 60 watts coming off the grid on each leg. So look what happens when I turn off the AC input. Now the battery jumps up to 182. So grid is disconnected. You can see that right here. No grid. But we're drawing 180 watt. I'm sorry, the stupid cat's in the litter box. Just what you wanted to hear, right? But we're drawing 180 some watts for 2 inverters to run and do nothing. That just seems a little bit excessive to me. And again, if I turn grid back on, again, if the idle consumption is supposed to be all come from the grid, it drops it down 80 some watts. So now there's a 100 watt draw coming off the battery for what? And again, you can see here, solar assistant, smart shunt, 100 watts, 100 watts. So let me turn the grid back off. Okay, we're back up to 182. And I know right now somebody's gonna say, well, you've got your solar assistant, your Raspberry Pi, and your smart shunt running. That's gonna be a draw. Okay, I'll give you that. So let's shut down the Raspberry Pi and unplug the buck converter. All right, so we're shutting this down. Now, from what I remember, the smart shunt's supposed to draw like 50 millivolts, so that really shouldn't be any draw whatsoever. All right, so the Raspberry Pi turned off and we went from what? 184, 182 down to 179. Okay, and I'm gonna unplug it right here. And then just for kicks, we'll disconnect the buck converter. This is so hard to do with one hand. Whose bright idea was it to put the fuse here? All right, fuse is out. Buck converter light went out. 177. So we've gone down a watt. And from the manual that I'd read, that buck converter is supposed to be 98% efficient. So even still, 178. So what am I missing? I mean, we've got no loads, we've got no AC, and yet we're drawing 178 watts of power from the batteries. Somebody do the math. 178 divided by 2? 178 divided by 2.
The answer is 89.
89 watts. So 89 watts in standby or idle consumption for each inverter. That seems a little excessive, doesn't it? I mean, I thought it was supposed to be 65, 70, not 90 to 94. I mean, yeah, I dropped, we'll say 7 watts. Just round it up, 7 watts from the Raspberry Pi and the buck converter, because you know you're not talking an awful lot of draw there. But still. All right, so let's do this now. 177. So we're gonna stay 178. Now we'll turn off the units and see what they are when the fans only run to cool them down for standby mode. 1, 2. Fans drop down to 50 watts. So inverting was 120 watts between the two inverters. 120, 125. If you haven't learned already, I don't like math. Okay, one fan turned off. Now they're both off. We're down to 0. 0.01, barely even registering. So am I going crazy here? I mean, it seems like it got worse compared to the original units that I had. Because I calculated, 70. The solar assistant gives you a spot where you can punch in what your idle consumption is supposed to be. And so, I had 70 on my old units. And now I'm up to, what did we say? 89 watts. That adds up. So I did find something else out regarding solar assistant and the idle consumption rate that I wanted to share, because it helps me understand a little bit, but not all of it. So I just turned off my solar again, so you're going to see all that dropping. So everything's zeroed out. You see 182 watts coming out of the battery, and you can see on the right that's exactly what's coming through the smart shunt. And obviously the Raspberry Pi is hooked back up, and based on the earlier video, we determined that about 178 watts is the inverter idle consumption between the two with no loads. If I remove the Raspberry Pi and the buck converter. So currently my idle consumption I put in here at 94 because that's what I had discovered earlier in some earlier tests. And then throughout what we just discovered earlier, if we say 178 watts divided by 2 inverters, it's 89. Even if we come to the configuration, disconnect, and set this to 89 watts, and then reconnect, the idle consumption that you program in Solar Assistant has no bearing on the battery, at least in my case where the smart shunt is involved. It's pulling the value directly from the smart shunt. And you can see that it's matching 181, 182. Within a half a second or so, it updates and shows proper. So you see no grid whatsoever. Now, we set the idle consumption to be 89 watts in Solar Assistant just a second ago. So let me go turn the grid on. Again, we have no loads. You see the grid just connected. And based on the comment from Signature Solar, the idle consumption should transfer over to the grid So now, coming from the grid, you see 178 watts. All that is the two idle consumptions put together. So coming in here, you see 89 watts under system power. If I go change that value, disconnect, advanced, let's just change it to 5 watts per inverter. Boy, wouldn't that be awesome. Connect, come back to the main page. So that's interesting. You can see for grid power, one of the inverters is using 5 watts and the other one is using 57 watts. Oh, nope, there it goes. Just took a minute. 5 and 5. So now the grid is using 10 watts. Only based on what we programmed in for the idle consumption. Obviously it's drawing more, but the idle consumption seems to only apply to whatever's going to be added to this grid value. So now if we actually turn a load on, now we're showing a load of 96 watts with 106 watts coming off of the grid. It's just adding the load. So you need to determine whatever you figure out is your idle consumption in order to properly show that grid value. We went through and did our test and we saw that we were having 178 watts for 2 inverters. That takes it down to 89 watts. So it should be around 277. See, I'm not good at math, but regardless. And I don't know how I'm going to piece this video all together. But you have your 91 watt load. Your grid is showing that 91 watts because it's in grid bypass. Adding on double your idle consumption based on what you programmed, and that's showing up as 269 watts coming off the grid. Alright, something else that's interesting here. Alright, so 40 watts, 36, 44, right around that 40 watt mark. So if I take my clamp meter, zero it out, and put it on the negative of the inverter that's got the load on it, 0.55 of an amp. So that's what, 25 watts? Something like that. Come over to the other side. It bounces. But it seems like more of the load's on the other side. Come back over here again. 0.68, 67. And we're at 42, 43 watts coming out of the battery. So if the load's supposed to be coming from the grid, or why are we seeing more? I mean, I got this one. This could be that pulsing load that is making sure that the battery's still there so that it can easily switch if needed. Anywhere from 0.05 to 0.2 of an amp. Zero it out. But this is a constant 0.55 on inverter 1, and inverter 1 is the only one that has a load on it right now. All right, let's test that theory. All right, so inverter 2, we're still seeing this pulsing. This outlet here is on inverter 2. The wood stove is on inverter 1, and that's the only load on inverter 1 right now. So if we turn on, let's not melt the meter, but if we turn on the heat gun, what happens to the power coming from the battery? Nothing. It still does that little pulsing. You can see 1300 watts coming from inverter 2 right now. And yet we're still seeing the low pulse there. .265 on this side. All right, so the only thing that comes to mind as to why inverter 1 is pulling half an amp is because it's the primary inverter, and I'm guessing it's the one doing the checking to see if there's voltage to be able to make sure that it can quickly switch from grid to battery in the event that it needs to. There's not much at all except for a little pulse here on inverter 2. But that's the only thing that comes to mind as to why it's fairly constant and higher on inverter 1. You know, I'm curious. I want to check one more thing. I know that option 3 sets the appliance voltage range. Appliance option is set by default is 80 to 140 volts. UPS is 90 to 140 volts. And originally, that's all I thought this option did, was just control the acceptable voltage. But as I was flipping through the manual, let me see if I can find it again. I think it's under the specs page. Okay, here we go. Transfer time. 10 milliseconds when it's in UPS mode, 20 milliseconds when it's in appliances mode. So I'm wondering if it's doing a higher voltage check for a faster switch time? I don't know, let's find out. All right, so here's where we're currently at. 42 coming out of the battery, 42, 46. So come over to inverter 1. We're gonna switch to appliance mode and then back out. Does it change anything here? Nope, not really. It's interesting. Now it actually went up to 67 watt draw. So did this inverter change? Yep, appliance. 67 watts. Alright, so I'm going to keep this. Actually, let's check this real quick before this thing times out on me. 0. Well, look at that. Now we're getting half an amp draw over here too. 0.62, 0.64. 0.62. Now they're evened out. Okay. 0.6667. So I'm gonna leave the camera over here and try and change this on the inverter. Switch from appliance mode to UPS mode. Now. Escape. I heard a click. I think the click was just it. The inverter's resetting. Huh. Okay. 0.12. And then on the other side, will all be. So UPS versus appliance mode does have to do with some kind of a draw. I honestly would have thought it would have been the reverse though. That dropped it down from, what was it? It was like 64, 65 watts down to in the 20s. Well, if nothing else out of this entire video, that was extremely interesting to find that one out. So when I got these replacement inverters, and I had actually seen that comment in the manual about UPS versus appliance mode and the transfer time being shorter when it's in UPS mode, I saw that and I thought, well, maybe I'll try that and see if it even diminishes the flicker when transferring between battery and grid. So that's why I had it in UPS mode to begin with. And I was actually trying to figure out why I had a smaller draw from the battery than I normally would when I had my old inverters. Because I had that, what was it, 60-some watt draw every time that I did that video on, trying to compensate for that draw by turning on the 2-amp grid charger. I had just thought that something had been fixed in these newer model inverters, and that's why I only had, 20-some watts of power being drawn from the batteries. So apparently it has to do with that mode. The only thing that comes to mind is appliance mode has to accept a wider voltage range, and there's something in regards to that which causes it drawing more power. Maybe it's, I don't know. I don't know what's going on. And the only thing that I can think of with the remaining power being drawn, that 0.1 to 0.2 of an amp being drawn for each inverter, is just the inverter's basically making sure there's power there so it can switch quickly. The same thing that you'll hear from there being a constant grid draw when you're in battery mode. There still is always going to be that little constant grid draw, making sure that the inverters can quickly switch over to grid if need be. Well, I hope you enjoyed that trip down the rabbit hole. Just call me the Mad Hatter today. I was not expecting to figure any of that out. I was really thinking I was just going to be documenting some annoyance that I found in regards to power draws. But hey, I'm always happy when I can find something positive out throughout all this troubleshooting in the back and forth. So hopefully it can help somebody else out. So again, y'all stay safe, stay warm, and we'll catch up with you later. Okay, one last thing. I promise I'll be done. So I checked this morning to see how the battery usage went last night, and you can see right now it's at 28-30 watt draw. And if we come here, you can see just various fluctuations, 20 to 30 up to 40, 45, 46. So the only thing I don't understand is if this is supposed to be some check on ensuring there's proper power in the event that the grid needs to switch back to the battery, why isn't it consistent? Why is it fluctuating so much? There seems to be no rhyme or reason. I mean, here's almost 50 watts just before midnight, and then into midnight just before 1 a.m. 50 watts. So why are we going from, 19 to 50?